Welcome to ABiQ's webinar looking at housing demand in Africa. I'm delighted to have three panelists on this webinar with me. And I'll start off by introducing Michelle first. So Michelle, I'll hand over to you. If you can just do a quick introduction.
Hi everyone, I'm Michelle Goliath. Obviously I'm from South Africa. You probably hear that from the accent. I'm an international sustainable development specialist, and I hope to join Dr. Pressy soon with a PhD in, hopefully if I can finalize it, in urban pacification solutions in contested space. I've worked in the housing domain for about 30 years all over Africa, and I work specifically with social housing, and then also very much in ecological green building, green technology, and many other sustainable development aspects. So I could keep you busy for a very long time, but I'll rather give other people a turn.
Thank you, Michelle. I'll hand over to Dr. Priska, a quick introduction.
Yes, my name is Priska Simbanegawi, originally from Zimbabwe, and I stay in South Africa, where I work at Wits University. So my research focus is on human settlements. And I'm such a huge fan for private sector solutions. And I also focus on poverty, how to try and help ourselves. And yeah, I'm happy to join you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Priska. Moving on to Thabang, who's been with us before. So Thabang, if you can just do a quick introduction.
Good afternoon, everyone. Once again, I'm excited to be on this platform. It's a privilege and a singular honor to join the big guns today on this lovely subject, affordable housing. My name is Thabang Rakwena. I'm an economist. I'm a property economist, and with special interest in both infrastructure and affordable housing. For me, affordable housing, I've been involved in affordable housing for over 9 years now. So it's not really a long time, but I've learned a lot, and I've earned my stripes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thought that wise, again, just to kick off with a bit of numbers, just to look at what are the drivers for growth in Africa. Africa is such a big place, and there's so much talk about what is the demand for housing going forward. So I thought, maybe take a step back and just look at, looking at population growth and what are those drivers driving the African and market growth. Sorry, that was too quick. So just looking at drivers for growth. So we put up a map, and we use a lot of the United Nations population forecast in our modeling. And I just wanted to put some numbers in there. So if you look at population growth over the next, 10 years, just up to 2030, and you can see, Africa as a continent will add close to 300 million people during or over this time. Population growth by North, West, East, Central Africa, and Southern Africa. And you just, look at specifically Western Africa, Central Africa, and also Eastern Africa. That's phenomenal growth in terms of population numbers, ranging from 28% over 30% in Central Africa. And just to put it into perspective, this is over the next 10 years, there will be 400 million more mouths to feed on this continent. And 300 million more kids to educate. These are, staggering numbers. And then in context, by 2050, half of the working age, the world's working age population will be based in Africa. So truly large numbers. Just looking at the main countries, we always look at just what are the big growth markets. So Egypt, Ethiopia, and Nigeria, and so on, and Kenya. Again, big markets. Nigeria, the most populous country in Africa, with over 200 million as we speak, will be 260 million by 2030. looking at housing demand. So what we do in our modeling is we look at, the 20 to 30-year-olds who are the new entrants into the housing sphere. Those are, typically the age where they leave the nest. They'll either go study or they go work in a city or elsewhere. So, mentioning that, we obviously will touch on urbanization as well, which is another driver in Africa. So, there's various numbers that we've looked at in terms of what is the current deficit, because that's something that needs to be addressed. And then you're obviously looking at the growth. So looking at this population growth, we estimate you're going to need about 15 million units across the continent just to cater to the new entrants into the market. In other words, all those young people in the 20 to 30-year-old bracket. But in addition to this, there's estimates putting, on the continent, 56 million houses needed today. So in other words, a deficit that exists, bringing a total of 71 million new units that's required by 2030. Looking at an affordable house, and this is just a model that we put up, and thanks to Tabang, who gave us some costing guidance. So just using a $20,000 house to build in the affordable housing sphere, you need about $1.4 trillion to build all these houses. That's a phenomenal amount of money. That's what is that, about a third of Africa's GDP at the moment. Just looking at the growth, so 300 million, if you just look at the 15 million, that's just the entrance into the marketplace. So that's kind of what we wanted to put out there, just as a start. And I will now just pass on over. I know there's a couple of slides, Michelle, so I'll move into your slides if you quickly want to run through those, and I'll start off with the first one. And I'll move on to, just let me know when I can move to the next.
Yeah, cool. I really think that what happens with with affordable housing is that we tend to create these concrete jungles. And if you're looking at the numbers before on the slides that you presented, Emil, it's very easy to see that there are millions and millions of people that need accommodation and will, going forward. But given that, very often people will try and find the solution as being this concrete block of housing that will be put up and create these big blocks of flats. You see them all over the world, and especially in China when you have very high densities. But Africa is very different, and sometimes we try to import too many solutions from other developed countries, and we lose our Africanness. So what we've been looking at from the think tank's perspective as well here is that you see quite a big interest in the combination of building technology with greening, but you don't always look at the economics of that. And you can get to see that when you are looking at bonded housing and finding finance for housing, you always run into the affordability issue. So people always choose something much smaller and don't actually consider looking at how to find alternative models for financing. So I think it's very important that we start to become creative, especially after COVID, and look at how do you finance that? You spoke about the 1.3 trillion, and it's quite a mammoth amount of money. And very often what will happen is people will just give up before they've started. So in this model that we've designed, it's really to look at, can the environment within which you build also contribute to paying the bond cost? And it's a very simple model that we've tested now, and we're busy testing in our city, which is a quite small city in South Africa. But I think that the principles of that are things that we need to develop and scale up or down depending on what solution we're looking at. And yeah, we've really looked at Nedbank in South Africa has a green bond, and we need to start linking financing to the Global Green Fund and things like that, as well as just your standard financing mechanisms. So we can basically, through this model, and the little picture is really a very low density, but you could replace these with social housing blocks or more dense dense buildings, depending on the upscaling or downscaling of the modeling. But you really need to start to integrate the thinking of environment differently in the provision of affordable housing. You can go to the next slide. Okay, in this example, and we've borrowed the concept from permaculture, but it's really to start looking at planning of housing estates from this kind of a concept. And the Swedes and the Scandinavians do this quite well. So in Africa, this kind of thing would work very well too. It would probably unpack and implement, we were talking earlier about implementation and theory, to be a different, it will look, the landscape would be very different in Africa versus some of the Scandinavian or other countries. But the concept of working in zones where you're combining the livelihood strategies with also economic producing systems that will actually add to the food security of the environment, but also if you do it on the right scale can actually become commercially viable, and that money can be put back into financing of housing. And there's a lot of different examples where this has worked differently, but I think what we're trying to demonstrate is that we need to start looking very differently at how we mass produce affordable housing, and that we don't just create these very sterile environments anymore. Yeah, and
I think that's certainly something that we've learned from COVID as well, is it not?
Yes. So you really need to concentrate on not only the finance. I mean, your presentation previously focused on how expensive it is, but it also really needs to concentrate on the environmental and social dynamics of the provision of housing. And by doing that, we would plan it very differently and implement it very differently, I think.
Excellent.
And yeah, that's my contribution.
Thank you very much for that. Priska, shall we move on to your presentation if you want to run through before we go back into a discussion on the various, how it all comes together?
Yes, thank you. I wanted to discuss affordability in the context of the primary mortgage market. And we always, in passing, we always talk about the purchase affordability. This is how much a household can qualify for. So it depends on the income as well as other things, employment and all that. So how much can a household qualify for to purchase a house, for how much? And we also talk about the repayment affordability, which is how they can service the mortgage or the bond. This one seems to be not a problem because it usually mimics how much a household can pay in rentals. So the problem one is to qualify to purchase a house is where the problem is. And when you look at household incomes, we are talking about people who are general laborers, who are domestic workers, the gardeners, restaurant workers. And they earn almost like 8 to 16 US dollars per day. This becomes almost just under 4,000 rands a month. So I think that some of the models must be able to put this into consideration. How much should they afford? How much should they pay for? Yeah, we can go to the next one.
Okay.
I was reading before this, and I wanted to sort of pave a discussion from Michelle as well, what she was talking about, to say, what should we really do? Maybe we need to build densely, repurpose what we have in a high-rise buildings. And because we know that we can build bigger outwards. So I like the circle that you put. It makes sense. It doesn't make sense to say where people are, we build sparsely. It doesn't make sense. it makes sense that we build upwards where there is concentration of people. It makes sense. And the land there is even more expensive. So it defaults into we have to build high-rise. But of course, we talk about culture, we talk about how we must do this. But it is cheaper to procure land from the outskirts, and then you build sparsely there. Yeah. So in the long term as well, it is better to think about transport networks. So it makes the location one is indifferent to where they are located. If you are powered by transport networks, in China, they talk of 30 minutes drive, fast railway lines and all that. So I wouldn't mind staying far away, and I'm connected to the economics of life. And now they are talking about the Zoom towns. One person by the name Vivek Sa is talking about where we used to go for vacation becomes our homes, our future homes, powered up by fruit trees and all that. What makes us happy as human beings, we can always work in our own homes. Yeah.
So, which potentially could be a bit of a contradiction to high density, yeah? Because I mean, I don't think we all aspire to retire in a high density tower necessarily. So is that, how does that fit into Dr. Priska? Is that something that you've looked at before? I mean, I've never seen one of these, so I'm just curious more than than I know.
It's something that we can always do research on. We always want to do that. We collaborate with industry.
Excellent. Yeah. Okay. I'll move on to the next slide for you.
People talk about modular construction, prefabs, container housing, and you hear a lot about it because it is quicker. But discussing a bit about it, you see that container housing, for example, in Joburg, we have them already. Environmentally, it is friendlier and it is more affordable, can be put up at a lower cost, less timely as well. Quickly, we can always set it up to solve our problems better than conventional brick and mortar. But there is resistance sort of to this innovation. And people sort of, the aesthetic barriers, people don't believe in them. And I think it's something that people can see as a case study and way to improve on. But it's a quicker way of housing people. The affordability part of it is a bit questionable because I saw that one is costing about 4,900 per month. So with those incomes we were talking about, it is on the less affordable side. So 60% of users reject the method due to its still aesthetics. So people just have a bit of, but the ones I saw were very nice, and I thought it's a solution to affordability. They also think of cladded, if they are cladded with some other materials to make it look more conventional, than to feel like it's just a tin brick, a tin house of some sort. So to make it more greener as well, using the concept that you were talking about, Michelle, is the way to go for the less affordable. It can be a solution. So this will reduce time. McKinsey and Company 2019, they were talking of how this can be used to accelerate project timelines. So it's something that you can put out and it works. And it can save construction costs as well, that you were talking about $20,000 US. Tabang saying this could be the minimum to construct. So compared to this one, this could be a solution. People can talk about this.
Good. I'll just move on to your last slide.
Yes, I wanted to say that the way I feel, the way I think is that if we take all the regulations and all the acts, all the policies in Africa, we can create a collaboration, a hybrid sort of working together with government. What does government have? And then we sort of large our construction efforts to that. We can draw subsidy money from there, we can draw grants, we can draw some green funding, all that together. And we must also never forget about the people. They can come in. I see a lot of people, they want to change their lives. They want to change their narratives. So we can also put them in to say, what can you bring in? Can you organize yourselves into a cooperative? Can you do self-help models? Can you plant trees where you are living? So can you build one room, the second room, the third room, incremental housing? So I feel sometimes we are not putting people, we say people do not afford, but I see a lot of zeal. I grew up in the rural areas myself. There was something that I think if I was taught, if I was shown how to collaborate, how to come together, I would have changed my neighborhood. I would have changed my life. So at all costs, we can apply the green building technologies, harvest rainwater, plant trees, do this so that we can create our communities, better communities. We can use donations, we can use sweat equity to create housing assets. And I think we must not look at housing as just something we are doing. We must create value. I listened to one lady who was explaining that sometimes what we build does not have value. So if something doesn't have value, we cannot evoke the secondary markets because it's of lower quality. So we need to try and find affordable housing for Africa, as I stand for every time. Thank
Excellent.
you very much.
And moving on to Tabang, just the last few slides on for you to go through.
Once again, good afternoon, everyone. The big guns have spoken. Sometimes you wouldn't even know where to start, but you know, I'll just shoot from the hip, so to speak. Africa is quite a big continent. So for the benefit of time and, you know, to try and, you know, make my presentation impactful, I've tried to isolate 7 countries. And the 7 countries, in this case, you know, they present, you know, I've been purposive in my approach. In the sense that, at least from these 7 countries, one is able to draw as much information as possible regarding the housing crisis as far as affordable housing is concerned. The country that seems to be grappling with it, our table, if I were to begin with, it's segmented into 3 major headings, which is the housing backlog, housing deficit, urbanization rate, which I believe, in order for us to properly define affordable housing, it should be defined within the tenets of those terms. For instance, looking at our table, we know that in order to properly define the housing crisis, we will look at the urbanization rate, which is coupled with poor planning, and this results in housing crisis. For instance, in Africa alone, you're looking at the average population growth rate of 2.53%. And this is covered for decades and comprising 1950 to 2050. This is based on the UN population study on housing dynamics in Africa. It's one of the interesting literature that I came across. So in this table, we know that the country with the highest urbanization rate is Angola. However, Nigeria is where the major problems are, in the sense that that is where the housing, both housing backlog and housing deficit are in the majority. Although the urbanization rate is less than that of Angola. And in this regard, it is followed by Tanzania with the housing backlog of around 3 million, with the housing deficit of 3 million again. And the third country in this regard, which should be maybe from our median in terms of the urbanization rate, is South Africa, which is sitting at 2,300,000 for both housing backlog and housing deficit. Maybe at this point in time, I need to explain the difference between housing backlog and housing deficit for the benefit of this discussion. At the housing backlog, we are looking at the difference of the housing, the households, and the number of permanent dwellings at a specific point in time. Whereas for housing deficit, we are looking at the difference between the households, number of households, total number of households, as against permanent dwelling. But this is a flow, it's time series based. So in this regard, we realize that once again that Nigeria is the one that is facing serious problems as far as this housing crisis is concerned, and we can the reader in this regard is able to notice that that is where the affordable housing is really a major problem. For the benefit of the time, I won't spend too much time on this slide. Can we move on to the next slide, please? And what are the challenges which for affordable housing, which must be looked at also as the key drivers in addressing the demand? For instance, one of the major challenges in Africa is unsecured title, which lead which are due to poor land registry and disinformation. This is a general problem in most African countries. And the banking sector is underdeveloped, as well as the capital market, which means financing bonds as far as how affordable housing is concerned is very complicated. There's also lack of investment in infrastructure, which must be viewed as a catalyst for housing development. For instance, there are no auxiliary services or amenities, which result in dysfunctional properties with no resale value. Therefore, banks have no appetite to finance them. And as a result, this leads to less transformed urban forms and inability in this case to leverage property as an asset. In Africa, building costs are usually high due to high construction costs, and these are less accessible to both low and middle income, which is the target market for affordable housing. Housing is not included. One major problem also, housing is not included in Asian national priorities in most countries, because if it is included in national priorities, particularly in this case, we are making reference to housing being situated, say, in the president's office as one of the key plans that would go along with. African countries are also associated with poor microeconomic environment, high interest rate, high inflation rate, low economic growth. They are also associated with weak spending power, which makes affordable housing less accessible to the general population. Next slide, please. And in affordable housing, I've attempted to look at the key players for housing delivery. The key players in housing delivery are government, private sector. Government, in this case, provides subsidies in countries like South Africa. And the banking sector is there for mortgage. There's also another interesting observation with the African countries. Microfinance institutions and NGOs are very active. Rather. There are also the development finance institutions, and all these key stakeholders. What are their roles? Their role is participation in policy implementation. They help design the policy implementation and programs to improve access to housing products to the poor. Going forward, what are the benefits of housing construction? In Africa, for instance, the minimum cost to eliminate housing backlog over 10 years is estimated to cost in the region of 2.80 trillion, which is slightly different from what I saw from your first slide, what was 1.4 trillion.
Yeah.
I guess data is getting updated as we go along. Here we are assuming that this could generate the total output of about 5.08 trillion using the spending multiplier effect of 2.5, which means for every dollar spent in the initial investment, that results in spending of about 2.5 years. Housing construction should also be viewed as source for inclusive, as source for inclusive growth, because they are normally labor intensive. And also in Africa, housing construction has initial multiplier, has initial investment multiplier effect of between 2 and 3, depending on the import content. For instance, in South Africa, for every house built, we can be sure to create about 3.14 direct jobs and 2.48 indirect jobs. This is according to the ruling, one of my previous teachers, my previous lecturers as well. And whereas in Ethiopia, you're looking at the contribution of the housing construction could be in the region of 2.24 direct jobs per housing unit constructed. This is Al-Hajj et al. This is in housing dynamics in Africa. It's another literature that I came across. Next slide, please. What are possible solutions to housing crisis? The possible solution to housing crisis are threefold. They are structural, they are funding related, and also they pertain to the triple P, which are your public-private partnerships. In this regard, triple Ps are considered as hybrid financing options, which are also could cause a dent in terms of resolving the problem of housing crisis. For instance, for looking at structural, here we're looking at the policy framework. Sometimes the policy framework doesn't really reflect the current reality. And the legislation is also outdated. For instance, urban planning is pretty much based on the colonial era. It doesn't reflect the current reality. And there's a difficulty of also procuring property rights because of red tapes that are involved in the legislation. And going forward, what do we do? There's an interesting development or innovation that I've come across in my reading. They refer to it as PropTech. This is one important development in the sense that it helps us to track information associated with land pieces. It's essentially a property management system, but it can help a great deal in terms of tracking information related to deeds.
Just in a matter of time, Tabang, sorry, we're just running a bit short on time here.
Okay.
We can maybe just move on to your last slide as well. Which clearly, well, that seems to be indicating in terms of shortages versus planned supply, yes?
Yes. The last slide should be seen in terms of what are possible opportunities that are there in which country. For instance, Nigeria, both Nigeria and Kenya present a very good opportunity for people that are wanting to invest in housing because of the fact that housing programs are included as part of national priorities. For instance, in the case of Kenya, they will now be going to elections, so they need to deliver about 100,000 units over a period of roughly 5 years. So this is an interesting opportunity for those that want to develop. And Ghana is also on an investment drive. It's also calling for more investment in affordable housing because most of Ghanaian housing is owner built. So they also trying to embrace affordable housing as part of the solution.
Good. Thank you very much, Tabang, for this. Much appreciated. I think if we go back to just maybe around, and then just ask, you know, is there a case study where we have examples of policies that's been, you know, is there any country, well, let's put it out, is there any country in the world that's got the right policy framework that would encourage, you know, the proper investment needed into not just developing housing, because I think that's something that we've agreed on, is that it's got to be a eco-style kind of setup. You know, we need something where we need infrastructure, we need jobs, we need, you know, whether that's built or focused around mining or industry or agriculture, you know, processing for that matter. Is there any good examples out there that you have come across? Michelle, maybe we kick off with you again.
Yeah, I think that, yes, there are various different pilot projects that they've done, but usually they contain elements of what you want. So there's not one overall model yet that I've seen that actually includes everything. So you'll find whether you go to any international conference on housing, everyone will come with a specific component, whether it's you know, technical solutions, technological solutions, green solutions, whatever. But I haven't come across any full example that's based, for instance, on the Sustainable Development Goals that cover all of them, or you know, that deal with development in that kind of a holistic way. And I think we have a lot to do in terms of policy development that takes cognizance of scale, takes cognizance of the people who use it, or who it's designed for, all of those things. And, you know, I haven't really seen one final product that I could say, okay, you could go and visit this pilot project and it would solve all or tick all the boxes. I don't think it exists. So I really think we have a lot of work to do in the sector to realize the potential of the sector and to deliver quality housing to people that ticks all those boxes. It's a lot of reworking, I think, that needs to happen.
To be done. Dr. Priska, from your perspective?
Yes, I know in South Africa, they built something called Conubia in Durban. It is based on inclusive housing, where you have social housing, RDP, you have everything good inside within different typologies. So it's also based on mixed use. They are also bringing in some retail buildings and everything. So it's a community by itself. And I think they have started also in Pretoria, where they are trying to build a smart city, which should be self-contained in everything that we are talking about. Okay. It should incorporate green building technologies. It should be well connected and networked. It should be a community where everybody lives, regardless of their background or everything. So I think people are trying, and I think South Africa, with all the problems it has, I think it is on the forefront in terms of Africa. It is trying to hear what the market wants and what the people want. I think they are trying to some extent. I can say that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there's some examples that we can start looking to. Tabang, from your point of view, is there any examples that you have just in terms of policy where you can think that's a market where they've at least moving in the right direction, and it's maybe an example for the rest of Africa to follow or to look at least?
I think that's Dr. Priska has already mentioned. South Africa presents a classic example, I think, which should be replicated across Africa. For instance, the self-contained development, your mega city, mega smart city project, good examples that could be really replicated across Africa. But the problem with our environment here is that there's lack of policy followed through. There's lack
Political
of
drive, political will to deliver.
yeah, political will. And Kenya, although it's following closely behind South Africa, I like the fact that, you know, they have a fully fledged triple P legislation, which should help also in financing affordable housing, which is, I think, you know, it's step in the right direction.
Okay.
Mm.
Yeah, indecision in direction. Good.
Mm.
I'm going to go into a couple of questions now. So we've got a question from Mr. Koza asking Michelle specifically, often in cities, the debate has been to develop urban agriculture, the development of polycentric models by applying new traditional design principles to enable the urban poor to have close access to an improved lifestyle, access to employment, etc. In doing so, would one avoid the historical challenges faced?
Okay, I think that I would say that you could use some historical planning principles and not all of them. I think it really depends on every solution needs to be custom made for where it is. And we tend to, as I said before, you try to find one solution that fits everything. And I don't think that's very wise very often, because you start to create environments that become non-livable. They just, like I said before, they become concrete jungles. So definitely in terms of dealing with poverty and informality and housing, that needs to be dealt with. And very often that is not dealt with in historical planning principles. So if I take South Africa as the prime example, we have to reverse basically every one of the principles that we applied previously because they were not sustainable. No, honestly. And, you know, we have to acknowledge the fact that we got it wrong and we need to redo it. And it's very difficult with renewal and things like that to remodel the landscape when you've done it already. So the trick is really plan it properly from the beginning, but also look at it being scale appropriate, being appropriate for the people who will actually want to live there, the cultural impacts of how people experience their livelihoods and their livable areas and things like that. All of those things need to be included in the planning principles. And in South Africa, I'm sorry to say, but even Spluma doesn't include those things. We're still doing land use management the old way. So, you know, if after 20 plus years, we're still not getting right because we're still cutting and pasting old, very Eurocentric colonialist policies in today's time, you know, we will never change the way things look. So we definitely need to do more work on those things. And yeah, so some of the historical planning principles are obvious that you would keep those. And they would deal with your cause, your establishment of nodes, your, you know, but really we need to rethink how we do that and make it more appropriate for Africa.
There's a follow-up question, which says, would Nedbank, which you mentioned, the Green Fund, provide financing to urban green projects, given that we also faced with large amount of land changes?
Yeah, I think specifically Nedbank, when you have a financier, they have very specific set rules on what they finance, how they finance it. But if you look at EDGE certification, for instance, in green technology inclusion in South Africa in green development, they do consider pilot projects that are unusual and more creative. So it would really depend on you being able to motivate why it should be funded. But also you need to look at co-funding. And the other speakers have in their slides indicated that there's not one finance solution. There has to be a combined matched finance solution. And very often it's a mixture of private finance and public finance. And that doesn't seem to happen. So the siloed approach of us working as the private sector on one hand and the public sector on the other, that's actually where it goes wrong. And we need to start to look at the value that Dr. Priska indicated as well. Of the value add is how is that value added from the different funding sources to create more livable environments. And it's not just about the rush to deliver a whole lot of houses, because that's what seems to happen.
Different drive. Good.
Yeah.
So Dr. Prisca, I've got a question for you as well. Despite the fact that it is cheaper to obtain land on the outskirts, the challenge that is often faced with that is that planning regulations and policies do not enable to increase the densities in the outskirts.
Yeah, that's what Michelle is talking about, to say unless we change
those policies,
these planning policies, we're not going to go anywhere. So it starts by acknowledging that our planning departments, our planning fundamentals have to change. So unless we do that, we cannot pave a way to new thinking, what we are talking about. To say it makes sense now to build higher where there are more people and to be allowed to build sparsely. So it has to change from a policy point of view. Yeah.
Okay. I think we kind of agree with that. So I think there's let me just go through a couple of more questions maybe. Okay, another question with the scale of affordable housing demand in Africa, is the demand backed by purchasing power, which we kind of said, no, there isn't the purchasing power. Why is the demand not being made by private sector in interventions? What's missing? Why does private sector not come on board? I think we've kind of touched on this already. So maybe Tabang, you're on the economist side. I mean, what is missing? What do we need to get private sector more actively involved in affordable housing?
Private sector, they are profit driven. However, one way of involving private sector could be in the form of the hybrid financing, which is triple P. And you're looking at investors that have appetite for risk, that is that investors that prioritize social return over equity return. So the way to involve private sector could be through hybrid financing, that is through triple P.
Through triple P. There's clearly not enough of that. Why is that? Is it because, I mean, for triple P, it needs to still be viable and sustainable. That I mean, we know that's one of some of the fundamentals of it. So I guess the question then is the way we assemble these opportunities or projects. Maybe that needs to be relooked at, because coming back to, I don't want to say affordability, but it's at the end of the day, someone's got to pay for it. And there's that income revenue stream that we need to look at. We cannot have projects, doesn't matter how it's financed, where you purely depend on low income or middle income people that needs to, pay thousands in rent every month or year, or, by default, I guess they won't have the money to buy it to start off with. So how do we package this in larger scheme? I mean, even if you talk about the smart cities, you can have mixed use. I mean, it's living in Dubai. It's fairly common to see mixed use developments where you have retail, there's commercial space, there's even to an extent industrial and housing. And then obviously there's different categories of housing. But I think I kind of get the feeling in Africa, having looked at all the other industries, because it includes your utilities, your power, your water, your wastewater, all the other services. If there's not a cross section of buyers that can actually afford to pay it, in other words, we need the businesses that can pay premium for power, because that will indirectly subsidize the person or the individuals living in there. And the same for housing. If we have a way where that as a development could generate premium leasing space, which kind of indirectly again subsidize the affordable housing component of it. I mean, I've not seen anything like that really on the African continent. Is there any insights you have on that? Is that a solution? Is that something to look at?
If I may come in there, in the case of smart cities or mega projects, one way to try and boost private sector's appetite is government de-risking the development in the form of, guaranteeing at least a supply, setting aside, a supply of houses that the developer is interested in building, so securing 10% that, that 10% is guaranteed, that say 10,000 units guaranteed stock that the government is going to buy. That is one way of, attracting private sector
involvement. But
involvement.
I'm not convinced that governments need to buy properties. I don't think that's the solution. It's not going to happen. If we're going to have to wait for government to really want to buy housing, we're going to still be in that position in 10 years' time. Yeah, I think we need to look at repackaging developments. I think if I can ask, let's do another round quickly, Michelle. If you're in charge, you're up there, and we say where to from now. How do we get this done? What is the next step? What would you do? What would needs to change?
Well, I think government must actually implement its mandate and not implement the private sector's mandate. I think we had a pre-discussion about this. Usually this role definition of what government is supposed to do and what private sector is supposed to do is very, it's a big gray area. And I think government should concentrate on being a facilitator of development readiness. And not and the funding should go into pre-planning and the bureaucracy and red tape involved in the planning processes and the development control processes are just too technical and too intricate, and they could be simplified to actually be a lot more development friendly. So very often there are a lot of developers, there is a lot of finance, but people just can't wait for so many years to implement things. So they go and implement them where there's a faster turnover. So really, I think it's about getting the development readiness in place and government to focus on how they are the triple P partner, not how they are trying to replace the private sector. And if everybody plays their correct role, that includes the community, and there's scope within the system for communities to build for a collection of different options, so that there's not just one solution for everything. If there's different scales, there's different implementation modalities, but if you don't have development readiness, you can't build anything.
That sounds to me, this is not the first time I've heard it. I mean, it does sound to me that, the idea of your donor foundations, because it seems like, all of the Africa funding, we're waiting for these projects to get delivered because we're waiting for donor foundations to hand over money. Maybe it needs to be better appropriated towards getting the plans in place. And let's get the donor foundations to fund everything up to construction, and then get the PPP take over from there on. The kind of, simplified way of looking at it. Dr. Prista, any last words from you? We have 1 minute left.
Yeah, I like the idea you are talking about, developers maybe focusing on other assets, and then housing as an extended product that is subsidized from these other financeable.
Yes.
Yeah, some people write about shared value. So you can target retail, schools, other things that you can charge on easily, and then housing becomes a beneficiary. So they are subsidized from that. So you are building your own communities. And I think developers especially, sometimes they irritate me because they realize that if they do not fix the housing problem, and nothing else works. So that's why we are where we are now, because people like to follow yields. How much yield do I get? In the long term, you can find your yields if you grow from within, if you latch up everything else. I think so.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So unfortunately, we ran out of time. I mean, an hour has gone by so quickly. I just wanted to thank you all for participating again in our ABiQ webinar. Definitely we'll have you back in the future. if you're available, when the topic comes around again for a discussion, and maybe go further down as a next step, moving on from what we've learned today and discussed today. But thank you very much, and I hope to see you back in the future. And to all our listeners, thank you very much for attending, and hope to have you back on one of our webinars in the near future. Thank you, everyone.